Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the Middle West podcast. I'm your host, Taqib Musa, and with me is my co-host, Asad Hussain.
Assalamu alaikum.
And today we're joined by a very special guest, Brother Mohammed Amin. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for joining us. So, Brother Mohammed Amin was the ex-chair of the Muslim Conservative Forum. He's been in the UK since 1952. He's done very, very interesting things throughout his time, starting off at Cambridge University. We just found out that back in the day he used to be a Trotskyist before he joined the Conservative Party, where he had a long and illustrious time. And when Boris Johnson became the party leader and now our great Prime Minister, that's when I believe you left the Conservative Party altogether.
That's right.
And you're waiting for some time to see who will kind of woo you and get you into their wraps.
Well, I'm giving Mr. Johnson 6 months because I think he will crash and burn. But if he's still around as leader of the Conservative Party at the end of this year, I'm going to look for another political party to join.
Okay, very nice. And I think
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think your insight and experience will be valuable to whoever gets it. So I wanted to I've been looking at your website, reading up on some of your work and all the kind of different topics that you write on. But I want to start right at the beginning. So I believe you were about just under 2 years old when you...
That's right. I was 1 3/4 when I came to the UK with my mother. My father was already here. He'd come back from Pakistan while my mother was pregnant. And my earliest memory, I have no memories of Pakistan and no memories of the journey, even though that would have been very memorable. My mother's told me about the flying fish that we saw, for example, but I have no memories of my own. My earliest memory is rolling on the floor in the hall of our house, having a massive tantrum, wanting to go home, wanting to go back to my grandmother, wanting to go back to my uncles, wanting to go back to my pet baby goat.
So you remember a tantrum where you wanted to go back, but you don't remember where back was?
No.
That's crazy, that, isn't it?
Yeah, but that's... So you came... you came straight to Manchester?
Yes, straight to Manchester, and I've lived in Manchester ever since. I still have a house in Manchester, although for the last 11 years I spent most of my time at a flat that I own in London.
Okay, very nice. And that's where let's... Did you go to school here? And I'm assuming at that time, we've had a couple of guests on from Manchester where they talked about the Muslim community and the way it's developed and the schools they went to. And I mean, Manchester is very much a very diverse city now, very metropolitan. And oftentimes, one of the previous guests we talked about, he said he didn't even interact with people outside his community until he went to university. And I'm assuming your experience is very, very different. Very different
because I grew up in the slums of Chorlton and Medlock, and Chorlton and Medlock is an area that you never hear referred to anymore. But if you want to know where it is in Manchester, if you look where Manchester University is, it's basically there. And the university's gradually expanded, all the houses were flattened, demolished, and most of them are now under the university campus. And at that time there were a handful of Pakistani families, and everybody else basically was white. I went to a primary school in that slum. There used to be maybe 2 children out of 30 that were from a Pakistani background or other ethnic minorities, and the rest were all white. From that primary school, I passed the 11 plus, which Manchester used to have in those days, and went to a state grammar school where, out of an entry of 150 children each year, 5 forms of 30 each. It's a boys' school, and you normally had 1 out of 150 who was ethnic minority.
And then from there, I think you went... So you did all your schooling in Manchester. As you said, you were from a not very privileged background.
My father and mother were both illiterate. My father was a very poor manual worker. My mother never worked out of the house, although she used to do a bit of sewing in the house. And from there, I went to Cambridge University.
So how does that happen? How does this... This is a very kind of... I think this is a very rags to riches almost story.
I was literally about to say that as well, rags to riches.
Well, I was at a state grammar school. The grammar school gave us very high quality education. I was in the top stream in that school. And the top stream had a special arrangement whereby we did 4 O-levels at the end of the fourth year. We skipped the fifth year entirely and went straight into the lower sixth to start our A-levels. So we did our A-levels 1 year younger than most people, which gave us the opportunity to have another year staying at school to do the Cambridge or Oxford entrance exams. And typically, the school would get maybe one person a year into Oxford or Cambridge. My year, we actually managed to get 3 in, one of whom was me.
Okay. Did you feel that people held you back or something, or your counsellors or something weren't convinced you could make it?
No, not in the slightest. This was a school which treated all of its pupils equally. A lot of them came from poor backgrounds. One of my friends, his father was a bus driver, and he eventually went to King's College, Cambridge, to study philosophy at the same time as me, and ended up as a professor of philosophy at Birmingham University. And the teachers encouraged us. And when applying to Cambridge, I knew that it would be hard academically, but I never had the slightest concerns that Cambridge would discriminate against me because I was either from an ethnic minority background or because I came from a very poor family. And when I went for the interview, after doing well enough in the exams to be called for interview, the only other candidate I met was a white boy from a public school. Can't remember his name or the school. And I'm certain in practice that he didn't get in, because otherwise the following September I might not have remembered him, because they say all white people look the same, but but he would definitely remembered me as the only ethnic minority there.
Yeah.
So the tutors who were doing the admissions selections clearly didn't choose to discriminate against me. That's why I get very annoyed today when I hear people saying Oxford and Cambridge discriminate against people from poor backgrounds. They don't. And I know they don't, not just because of my own experience, because I'm on the alumni council at Clare College, and I know from that role how much effort Clare College puts into outreach to encourage applications from disadvantaged areas. So
how do because a lot of the times when this argument is made, they put in the stats of I think the last year in Cambridge there was far less than 10% of kind of BME students made it in and things. I don't recall the exact facts, but that's what I was reading in the Guardian one of the days. How do you respond to that?
There are two causes. Cause number one is people self-selecting against. So you will get bright kids from working class backgrounds, from ethnic minority backgrounds, who say, Oxford and Cambridge won't want somebody like me, so I won't apply. The other issue you get, and that I think is the biggest single cause probably, the other issue you get is that you still have to have the right level of academic quality, intellectual variability, interest, etc. So let me take a sort of slightly sort of jaundiced example. Let's say you've got somebody from an ethnic minority background, Muslim, who has spent his entire time at school studying his school subjects, hasn't read a single novel, has read nothing about history, about politics, who knows nothing about our country or the world, who spends all his time interacting with other Muslims. When you put him in front of an admissions tutor at Oxford or Cambridge, he's not going to interview well. And that isn't the university discriminating. What you've created through that life experience is a very unsuitable candidate.
And what kind of things do interviewers ask in terms of like that? So you're saying this person's done well academically, but they've only focused on the academic side.
Only focused on the academic side. As I said, the person I created, and it was a caricature. Yeah. This person has never read a novel of any kind. Totally unsuitable person. I mean, when I went for my interview, I had one technical interview, which was supposed to interrogate me about mathematics to make sure I knew my stuff, quite apart from the exam, and one sort of general interview. The general interview turned into a long chat about why science fiction gave us extra insights into humanity and where it's going. And the so-called mathematics interview very quickly got diverted into a long discussion about the Japanese game of Go, because I play Go. The person interviewing me had seen Go being played in Hawaii, where he'd had a sabbatical year or something. So you have to be what's called a rounded person. And the person that I described for you, the caricature I created, was my deliberate attempt at creating a non-rounded person.
And kind of what drove you through all these years to kind of push yourself to do that? Because a lot of people, I think, don't go out there, don't push themselves, even though they might be capable, they might be intelligent enough, they might have the resources available, especially here where you have access to libraries and stuff easily, even if you can't afford the books, but they just don't push themselves. And what was driving you? Because I'm assuming, like, you know, you didn't have the guidance and everything at home to be able to help you and push you towards that.
Yeah, I had no guidance of any kind from my parents. I had massive amounts of love, and that's very important. It's wonderful to be able to grow up and have two parents who absolutely dote on you, who are totally committed to wanting you to succeed, even if they don't know how to help you to do it. My father used to take me to the public library by car. He couldn't help me to choose any books because he was illiterate, so I chose all my own books. I still remember, as you always remember these things, the very first book I ever borrowed from a public library was a book of home chemistry experiments. Couldn't do any experiments, we had nothing at home to do them with, but I read the book. And one of the things I've always been fortunate about in life is I simply have an enormously high level of personal curiosity, far more so than other people I know, because even one of my sons, when I was bringing them back from Manchester Grammar School, complained to me, "Dad, one of the things that's so annoying about you is that you're curious about everything."
Yeah, I think that's, maybe it can get tiring sometimes, but at the same time, that's what's helped you to kind of get where you are. So when you get to Cambridge, you're in this kind of cocoon of, the elite of, that's
Yep.
what the elite of society, people who went on.
One of the people I used to hang around with was the son of the Bishop of Woolwich. There was a very famous Bishop of Woolwich called John Robinson in the 1960s, who wrote a book called Honest to God. And one of the people I used to hang around with was his son. Another person I remember in my same group at Clare College, not quite as close, was the son of David Attenborough.
And how does that kind of, did you feel like at points you had to compromise on your principles, or feel very pressured into, because a lot of people are quite worried about, and sometimes they'll make conscious decisions of not interacting with certain things or networking correctly because they feel that they're kind of compromised to be around alcohol, or all of their friends are kind of hanging around drinking, and they feel very pressured to do that. And
no, I never particularly felt pressure to compromise any of my principles. I was conscious of my underprivileged background compared with them, although that didn't stop us interacting. The big difference it did make is this. I spent all my university vacations at home, and I did that for two reasons. One, financially, our family couldn't afford for me to go on the foreign trips that all my sort of friends were going on. But secondly, when your parents have sacrificed everything for you, the one thing that you can give them back is your physical presence. And that's why I spent my time at home during the vacations, because I wasn't seeing them during term time at all. My parents never came to Cambridge to see me, couldn't afford it. Would have felt sort of strange doing it. And afterwards, when I left my university and started my career, I never contemplated working away. Many new graduates from my kind of background might want to go and work in Hong Kong or New York or London. I never even contemplated that, because I knew that I had a moral duty to be with my parents. I was fortunate that I lived in Manchester rather than a small backwater. So in Manchester, you can have an outstanding career working for wonderful organisations and still be in Manchester. So I lived with my parents until eventually they were living with me, and then they died. But I never left home.
Okay, and I think that's something that kind of, I'm assuming after graduation, is a responsibility on you financially as well as, and something that you could kind of.
It's a fundamental moral obligation.
Rochdale's a backwater, by the way. I just wanted to.
Rochdale is within easy commuter distance of Manchester.
Yeah, it's very easy. So someone asked me, they go, "Where are you from?" I said, "Yeah, Manchester." It's much easier than saying Rochdale.
Yes.
Plus, you don't have to explain where Rochdale is on a map.
And a lot of the stigma attached to Rochdale as well.
So kind of going about that, like you were at term time, you weren't able to see your family at all. Were you able to, like, did you feel isolated at all there? Did you feel like you had two separate worlds going on?
I occasionally felt homesick. I think the very first term, certainly my first year, I remember reading the Sunday Times newspaper and the colour supplement. It was a long profile of Rose Kennedy. Rose Kennedy was the widow of Joseph Kennedy and the mother of President Kennedy. And it was she was very elderly by this stage, and it was talking about how hard a life she'd had, her sons dying, Joseph Kennedy killed in the war as a bomber pilot, John F. Kennedy assassinated, Robert F. Kennedy assassinated. And I read this article, and I broke down and started crying. And I realized that one of the reasons I had broken down and started crying was simply an emotional connection with Rose Kennedy and her traumas. But at the same time, you're self-aware enough to know that you're suffering a bit from sort of homesickness. Well, that was all. I mean, I had 3 great years at Cambridge, a wonderful time.
And then you moved back to Manchester, so was that...
Well, then I spent a year at Leeds University doing a postgraduate certificate in education, because very early after arriving in Cambridge, I realised that I wasn't going to be able to pursue the career that I'd always wanted when I was a teenager at school. I always wanted to be a research scientist, preferably in theoretical physics or astronomy. And I'm a bright guy. My IQ was measured as 1 in every sort of 250 of the population. But I realised at Cambridge, around me, some of my friends were probably 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000. And if you go into the kind of scientific career that I wanted, I felt I would never be any good. And I didn't have any plan B as to what I wanted to do as a career. So I then put off any difficult decisions by doing a postgraduate certificate in education. It's another year of education. Of course, once you've done a teacher's qualification, the natural next step is to get a job teaching, which is what I did. I taught for a year at a school in Oldham, first school I applied to. But while I was teaching, I discovered accountancy, switched to accountancy, and never looked back.
Okay, that's very. I think that's a lot of people feel that, like, during university they have one aim, and I think it's very. I've never heard it mentioned so kind of so honestly and briefly that, you know, this is what it is. I was very intelligent, but actually, some of my peers were. It's a very kind of a very honest and frank way of, I think, putting it.
I mean, it's easier. It's easier to be honest and frank about yourself and your limitations, when actually you know at the same time you're pretty good. If you had to admit to yourself that I'm in the sort of bottom 25% of the population, that's a harder thing to say than to say that I know I'm what in the top 1 in 250 in my sort of brain power, but actually that isn't good enough for what I really wanted to do.
Yeah. Although I think a lot of people even don't even admit that. But you go on into, so you're working in accountancy in Manchester.
Yeah.
And were you involved in politics at all in Cambridge, or was it all later?
I've been interested in politics from at least since the age of 10, if not earlier, from watching the news. At home, we had a television. My parents didn't watch television particularly. They spoke some English, but it wasn't great. So I just used to choose to watch whatever I wanted on television. And I watched a fair amount of fun. I remember The Lone Ranger, Batman, all that kind of stuff. But also I used to watch lots of documentaries and lots of news. And I remember very clearly, at the age of 10, asking my mother to wake me up tomorrow at 6 o'clock rather than the regular 8 o'clock to go to school, because I wanted to get the result of the American presidential election as quickly as possible.
Oh, wow.
How old were you then?
10.
10.
So
this was
Kennedy?
Kennedy Nixon.
Okay.
And of course, I was supporting Kennedy, young, glamorous, etc. But at the age of 14, I stayed up all night, both for the British general election television programme and for the American presidential election television programme. So I've been interested in politics from a very early age.
Okay, this was Kennedy-Nixon election, I think.
1960.
1960, and Nixon won?
No, Kennedy won.
Kennedy won, okay. I don't know, 60s. I don't know what's going on.
It's called learning history.
Yes.
I know the history of the
Shots.
1930s. I wasn't alive then.
So
Shots.
I would fail a Cambridge interview if I.
So
went
you're saying that your interest in politics started when you were 10 years old.
Yep.
Yeah,
How
that's,
did-
that's phenomenal.
Now a lot of politicians, their political careers shoot off during university, so they'll join either the party society, so you have the Conservative Society.
Yeah,
etc.,
at Cambridge, I was a member of the Cambridge University Labour Club because I was a Labour supporter. I mean, my father was a Labour voter. We were a very poor family. Harold Wilson was much more glamorous than Sir Alec Douglas Hume. So it was natural for me to grow up as a Labour supporter, and I arrived at Cambridge as a Labour supporter. I was a member of the Cambridge University Labour Club, but I was also a member of the Cambridge University Conservative Association because most of my friends that I hung around with were members of that. I used to go to events organised by both. I actually went to more Conservative events than Labour events because they had better speakers and better food.
It's always about the food.
Yeah.
It has to be.
Right.
But you mentioned that before you were Conservative, you were a...
Well, so I go through the sort of life history. I was Labour then.
Okay.
At Cambridge, I used to read something which doesn't exist anymore called the Shilling Paper, and it was a left-wing sort of rag, printed by students, sold on the streets, etc. Quite left-wing. Gradually became more left-wing. Then I went to Leeds University, and at Leeds University, I used to hang around with a lot of Trotskyists because I'd been heavily influenced by some of the books I'd read. In particular, I'd read several books by Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, including Isaac Deutscher's wonderful 3-volume biography of Trotsky. Isaac Deutscher was a Jewish intellectual in the UK, and he wrote this fantastic biography of Trotsky. So Trotsky was my hero at that time. And so I joined the Socialist Labour League, which was a party that eventually became the Workers' Revolutionary Party many years later. Then I finished at Leeds, started teaching. As soon as I started teaching, you save money, because we've always been frugal. And as soon as you've saved £50, you buy some unit trusts. And buying unit trusts isn't really compatible with being a Trotskyist. So I drifted back into mainstream Labour. So I was a mainstream Labour Party supporter during the 1970s, voted Labour in 1979, watching the election results down in London, my father-in-law's house. I couldn't stand it. I gave up at 3 o'clock in the morning because normally I stay up all night. But Margaret Thatcher was winning, and it was so painful I couldn't take it. After 3 o'clock I went to bed. So I was gutted. A year or so later in Manchester, some people introduced me to the local Liberal Party, and I joined them. I used to enjoy leafleting with them, but I gradually realised that when we talked politics, I was tending to disagree with them and agreeing more with that woman on the television, Margaret Thatcher. In particular, around then, I watched a 10-part television series called Free to Choose, made by Milton Friedman, Professor Robert Mackenzie. You can still find it on YouTube, and I've embedded it on my website. And I read Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, became completely convinced about the virtues of free market capitalism, and I went looking for the local Conservative Party to join it. So I joined the Conservative Party in 1983.
So you became interested in Milton Friedman after Margaret Thatcher won because he was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, wasn't he?
Yes. One of the people who really influenced her.
Yeah. And this whole kind of free market capitalism, neoliberalism movement.
That's right.
So from going from a Trotskyist
All the way into
to a liberal
Yeah.
to a Thatcherite, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, Marx was a great thinker from the 19th century, but on all the key issues he was wrong. It's as basic as that.
Is that objective or is that subjective?
Well, I remember Marx was saying that a consequence of capitalism would be the perpetual and growing impoverishment of the workers. You look at the richest societies in the world, the UK, the USA, Sweden, Germany, France, etc., they are not societies which have impoverished the workers. Capitalism works. So if you look at the countries which were impoverished, it was the attempts at state-imposed socialism like the Soviet Union. China was desperately poor until they started using capitalism. China, you've got this peculiar hybrid. You've got the Communist Party of China as a sort of party dictatorship. You've got quite a lot of state-owned industry which is hopeless and inefficient. What makes China successful is privately owned Chinese businesses, capitalism in other words. Capitalism works and socialism doesn't. It's as fundamental as that.
So when you say capitalism works and socialism doesn't, is you're examining that from the point of view of society, right?
Yeah.
So capitalism works for society and socialism doesn't work.
And
for
works for
society.
the people in that society. It makes everybody better
so
off.
the claim is that it works for everybody as
Yes.
well. But then you have people who are saying...
But it doesn't mean you have to abolish the state. I'm not saying abolish the state. You need the state to provide regulation. You need the state to deal with issues of monopoly. You need the state to deal with issues such as education. There's no incentive for monopolists to create education for school children. That's where you need the state.
Increasingly, throughout time, post-globalization, you'll have the emergence of TNCs, and they'll be cross-border, and the regulation will be much harder to impose on these companies. And what you'll have as a result of these companies being so powerful as they are, some being as more powerful than some countries in the world, is that they are essentially untouchable in certain aspects.
No, that kind of thing gets said all the time. It's simply not true. Even tiny, unimportant countries in Africa are able to take effective action against the operations of multinationals in that state if they wish. Separate issue is whether they wish to, because there's quite a lot of corruption in those countries. If you look at the fines that are being levied right now by the European Union and some of the big American tech companies, the idea that multinational companies are more powerful than countries is said regularly is simply not true.
So you'll have this idea of the European Union being brought as an idea, as an example, showing that we can regulate and we can pull and push with these companies. But then you'll have examples like Shell, the Shell and Delta, these companies, oil companies in America going to places like the Niger Delta and fracking and digging and resourcing oil from the country and then leaving water supplies contaminated.
That's a function of the poor quality and the weaknesses of the Nigerian state. It's up to the Nigerian people to sort themselves out.
Then we have this idea that, okay, maybe the country does have the power to stop them and say, listen, enough is enough. But then we have to answer the question of whether or not the country can possibly do that. Not because they don't have the power to do that, but whether they really benefit from doing that. So you'll have a country and where a company comes and says, we'll give you this many jobs, but we'll need to lower this and lower that expectation and that bar standard.
The failures of a country like Nigeria are the fault of the Nigerians. To blame them on outside parties is, in my view, superficial.
I think we're not necessarily blaming. It's there is a certain amount of strong arming involved in this, in my opinion.
But anyway, we're never going to resolve that in 45 minutes.
No.
Yeah. I'm just saying.
I think it comes down to a wider kind of view that a lot of people take, that a lot of the problems caused, for example, in the Middle East, are a legacy of and not completely, obviously, but there's a large part to play of Western colonialist powers and kind of the weak institutions that they left behind, which became a legacy and then which impacted the running of those countries.
Undoubtedly, foreigners will always try to meddle in your country, whatever country your country is. But my key message is that all of us make choices. We make choices at the individual level, we make choices at the society level, and the outcomes that people have are a function of the choices that they make themselves. If you look at Pakistan, for example, the growth of religious extremism, that is a choice of Pakistanis who wish to have religious views that are extreme religious views. Nobody makes you have extreme religious views. You choose to have them.
Yeah, and I think the argument on the other side is that if an American drone destroys your village and your family, and you have nothing else to turn to, which I think can be said is a fault of the Pakistani state for not providing an alternative. But they kind of that's what drives them into it, the horrible conditions that they're a part of.
If you look at the Punjab or Sindh, those areas do not suffer from American drone attacks, but you have 100 million people choosing to spend their time consuming extremist television channels, choosing to become more religiously extreme.
I think that brings in a very interesting. Although I didn't know this would go into religious extremism, but the kind of the so again, bringing that conversation back to home,
Yep.
and especially with the Muslim community, because you have years of experience, especially in Manchester, and with initiatives that you've done, such as Muslim Jewish Forum, etc. Do you think that we, as a community, have an extremism problem that's bigger than that's kind of a legitimate threat to the country? Because one of the things that's always quoted around is far right extremism doesn't get talked about enough, whereas we're always going on about Islamic extremism, when far right extremism, the number state has a larger problem. So do you think that's a problem in British society?
Well, first of all, there's no such thing as the Pakistani community or the Muslim community. There are multiple communities which have very different backgrounds, very different sets of beliefs and views, very different characteristics. Even comparing people who live in Manchester with people who live in Rochdale, for example, there is a difference. There is a difference in economic outcomes. There is a difference in socialization. Some of it is a function of physical geography. In other words, how concentrated is the community we're talking about in terms of mixtures of Muslims and non-Muslims together. It's a function of job opportunities. It's a function of a whole variety of different things. So one of the things I try to avoid, I never talk about the community. There are pockets of people. Looking at British Muslims as a whole, I don't have any reason to believe that there are large numbers of extremists amongst them. But even a small number of extremists are a problem. And I'm much more concerned not about the violent extremists, the people who actually want to get knives in a van and go and kill people on London Bridge, because they need to be dealt with. We need to find out what causes that. But actually, I'm much more concerned about those people who feel slightly sympathetic towards them, or who would never contemplate committing violence themselves, but actually don't want to mix with non-Muslims, for example, who think that our society is a fundamentally haram society. And those are the kinds of attitudes that I'm much keener on trying to challenge and address. And those are still a minority attitude amongst British Muslims. If I look at my extended family, most of which is down in London, they are people who are getting on with life. They are working, almost all of them, in organizations that are predominantly non-Muslim, because Muslims are only 5% of the population. They're working for big companies.
And what kind of... so how do we kind of because I kind of agree with that, is that when we talk about us as a community, we should talk about us as a British community, and not kind of slabs and sections, these people are...
One of the things I have taught myself quite rigorously is to be very, very careful about my use of language, because language conditions the way that other people receive what we say. It also conditions the way that we start to see the world ourselves. So if you teach yourself to use the word we only to mean the entire population of the United Kingdom, and use other words when you want to talk about either Pakistanis in Britain or Pakistanis in Rochdale, that takes you a long way further forward.
And so when we talked about challenging that, kind of countering narratives, and I think David Cameron used the word non-violent extremism. Mm-hmm. The government's done various things such as the Prevent program and things like that. And to what extent do you think that's been successful? But also, what do you think we should be doing to kind of to increase community cohesion in our society?
Well, first, the Prevent program, conceptually, I am totally supportive of it. The implementation of something that big, that is meant to, for example, touch every single school in the country, every single university in the country, you're never going to get 100% perfect implementation, and the cases when things go wrong get enormous amounts of publicity. Sometimes those are valid criticisms of something that has genuinely gone wrong. Other times they're actually false criticisms of something that actually wasn't really a problem at all. And of course, from the time that Prevent was first launched and right through to today, there has been a small organised lobby of both left-wing non-Muslim academics and some Muslims who, frankly, have attitudes that I don't really like anyway, trying to rubbish Prevent's reputation. And in many ways, unfortunately, they've been quite successful, which is one reason why the previous government has launched an independent review of Prevent, although I'm not sure where that's got to at the moment, but it is apparently sort of going to happen. But the fundamental goals of Prevent I support entirely.
When you said that kind of, I mean, I don't know if you imply this or not, but you said a lot of left wing Muslim academics,
no,
or
non-Muslim academics, non-Muslim.
Oh,
that's the key
okay.
point. These are left-wing academics who, because they're left-wing, they're generally opposed to anything governments do anyway. But they, along with a small number of slightly extreme Muslims, have been the vocal lobby against Prevent. If you, for example, if you go to my website, you can find an article about why these 150 academics that criticise Prevent are wrong. If you look down the list of signatories of the letter that I'm critiquing, an enormous proportion of those signatories are not Muslims. They're just left-wing academics.
I think in the Muslim community, there seem to. So, I mean, I guess that's one argument, that they're just against government. But do you think they have any kind of other agenda? And why do you think within the Muslims there doesn't seem to be much buy-in for the Prevent program?
A lot of them haven't really thought through the issue very well. I mean, I've had a lot of dealings, for example, over the years with the Muslim Council of Britain. I used to be a member of the Central Working Committee for 2 years, although it was quite a long time ago, 2008 to 2010. And it comes back quite fundamentally to this question about the terrorists that we're talking about, the London Bridge attackers, the 7/7 bombers, the other ones in between. Quite a lot of Muslims have real problems accepting that these terrorists were motivated by their understanding of Islam, when it's patently obvious that they were motivated by that understanding of Islam, because they tell you. If they record suicide videos, it's quite clear from the suicide video. If you watch Mohammed Sadiq Khan, the leader of the 7/7 bombers, watch his suicide video, read his words, it's quite clear he thought he was a holy warrior on behalf of Muslims, and that when he died, he expected to go to heaven. He thought he was doing a virtuous act. He was clearly motivated by his understanding of Islam. The fact that he's completely wrong is irrelevant. He was motivated by the way that he understood Islam. And the reason why organisations like the Muslim Council of Britain cannot bring themselves to say those words is because they feel, at a time when Islam is regularly being attacked by non-Muslim bigots, people like Robert Spencer in the United States of America, who argue that Islam is an inherently violent religion, that the real Muslims are people like Muhammad Sadiq Khan. That's true Islam. That's Robert Spencer talking. The Muslim Council of Britain and others who are opposed to Prevent and opposed to this concept about violent, non-violent extremism, they feel that if they concede that point in the slightest, if they concede that Muhammad Sadiq Khan was motivated by his understanding of Islam, that somehow, you know the old saying, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. They feel that if they make that acceptance, then somehow they're giving the game away to the anti-Muslim bigots like Robert Spencer. It's a fundamental lack of self-confidence on their own part, a lack of self-confidence in themselves, and indeed, in my view, a lack of self-confidence in Islam itself. That's why I have no hesitation at all in saying that these terrorists are motivated by their understanding of Islam. Their understanding of Islam is junk, but they are motivated by their understanding of Islam.
And the key thing is their interpretation of whatever Islam is completely false, and it's held by fringes of, like, very small fringes of the population, and there's only 0.0001% who would hold it. But I think kind of going back to that and 9/11 and 7/7, I've read a few bits of history. I mean, for me, it's very interesting in terms of integration, because I always find it. I'm relatively new because I moved to this country, not my parents, and yet I have.
How old were you when you came here?
I was 18 when I came, so right. I came here straight for university, and it was only.
And which year was that?
2012.
Right.
So it wasn't even that long ago. Yet I feel very comfortable being British, or calling myself British or a member of this community, even though I have alliance, like my family live abroad. And I always find it very interesting that people who've spent 30, 40 years here don't feel 100% British. We've had a whole couple of podcasts talking about the concept of home and kind of here and there and that kind of thing. But I've read studies on how it usually takes maybe 4 or 5 generations or at least 3 generations for people to truly lay down roots in an area. Do you think that's accurate? Do you think that's happening? And do you think 9/11 and 7/7 pushed us back?
It depends on a variety of things. People's personal circumstances and the circumstances of the community immediately around them. So if I look at myself, because we were so poor, from 1952, when my mother and I came to the UK, until 1969, not a single member of our family set foot in Pakistan. We couldn't afford it. When my mother's mother was dying in Pakistan, my mother couldn't afford to go to see her. In 1969, when my father's mother was dying in Pakistan, he was able to go and see her. You know, we had moved up the scale just a little bit, and travel had become that little bit cheaper. So we were physically here rather than regularly going back to Pakistan, whereas now many people regularly go back every summer. Their children spend a lot of time over there. That's one big difference. The second big difference is that I was growing up in an environment which was almost all white, apart from a small handful of close Pakistani Muslim friends, who I remain close friends with right through to today, even if I don't see them very often now. And I was at a school that was almost all white. My working career was in environments that were almost all white, non-Muslim. So a very different set of experiences from somebody who is born in Rochdale today, who grows up in an environment where most of the people around them will be of Pakistani Muslim origin, where satellite TV is on all the time in their home. All the television channels when I was growing up were, of course, ITV, BBC, and that was it. Where trips to Pakistan are very common now, of course, with Facebook, FaceTime, etc. That level of contact with Pakistan grows even greater. And, of course, it's much harder objectively for those people to decide that they are sort of really British and that Pakistan is a foreign country. So you have to look at people's circumstances.
Do you think it's necessary to have kind of that kind of dichotomy of kind of you're one or the other? Because I feel I always
there's
feel
a
that,
spectrum.
Yeah.
The poles I'm illustrating are the sort of extremes, and there's all kinds of gradations in between. The level of affinity that people have with a foreign country depends on all kinds of things, including the state of the foreign country. I grew up feeling sort of very attached to Pakistan, even though I had no memories of it, just because of what I got from my parents, etc. But then in 1971, when I saw the abysmal way that the Pakistani armed forces behaved in Bangladesh, I became much more anti-Pakistani at that stage because of Pakistan's behaviour in Bangladesh.
So for you, judging on whether you like Pakistan or not was basically on objective facts. So a lot of people feel a connection saying, okay, Pakistan does this, but I'm inherently Pakistani, so I can't really say anything against it. It's like a white man in Britain.
I feel like you can.
Well, you can.
But
I'm saying, as an example, if somebody in the UK was to comment on British accents overseas, they wouldn't be fully just like, I feel as though the actions are completely terrible, this and that. Most of the time, you'll have this kind of sentiment towards Britain as your home. Because I feel like you'll give a bit of leeway to it. But you saying that after you saw Pakistan's actions and Bhutto's actions in Bangladesh in 1971, you totally disagree.
No, don't blame Bhutto. Bhutto came afterwards. Bhutto came to power after the armed forces had done it. It was all under Yahya Khan, I think, from memory.
Okay, you're talking about the armed forces or Bhutto assassinating political opponents? Which one?
No, but basically, I think one of the things was Bhutto didn't accept the result of the elections, in which the entire province of Bangladesh. So there were more votes for the Bangladeshi candidate Mujibur Rahman.
Yeah, Mujibur Rahman should have become Prime Minister of Pakistan.
Yeah. But because I think with that kind of narrative of you can't criticize yourself, that's what Trump basically said to Ilhan Omar and said, get lost, go back home if you want to criticize. But don't. So for me, I think a lot of people go through kind of that. Like the background that you talked about of, always being surrounded by or almost being cut off from home, and they come out of that with a stronger longing because they can't or they don't feel. And as you said, there's loads of reasons why people have different experiences and they might not ever feel welcome, but they come out of that feeling very detached from Britain because they always feel like a foreigner here. And I think I've had a couple of people say to me that they never felt more Pakistani than when they came outside of Pakistan and everybody called them a Pakistani, whereas inside Pakistan they always felt like, a Sindhi or Balochi or whatever they were.
So even most fundamentally of all, though, you see, I see the world through my eyes. I don't feel that I regard the state, whichever state you belong to, as fundamentally a cooperative venture. I'm British, because in this world you have to have a passport of some country. I'm British because I like this country. If I felt that I wanted to be more French than British, I could perfectly well contemplate moving to France and choosing to be French. So being British is a choice in the same way that being a member of the Carlton Club is a choice. There are things you get out of it, the ability to travel, having a secure police force, etc. And there are obligations you assume, like the obligation to pay taxes, the obligation to fight and defend your country if necessary. But it's a choice. I see nations as collaborative ventures of individuals rather than things that individuals belong to by necessity. I remember reading something by Kemal Ataturk that from the moment you're born as a Turk in Turkey, that your duty is to the Turkish state and all that kind of stuff. The same kind of thing dictators come out with everywhere, and I regard it as fundamentally flawed. The obligations that you owe your society are a function of the fact that society is a collaborative venture. Society doesn't own you. Britain does not own the British people. Britain is what the British people choose to make it together. Can you see the difference? Yeah,
and that means that if a person who grew up in another country comes to Britain and chooses Britain as this is where I'm going to live, this is the society that I'm going to be part of, that I'm going to be contributing to, that I'm going to give my taxes to, etc., then they're just as British as anyone else.
That's right. And it's a society. All societies have positives and negatives. No society is perfect. Only God is perfect. So you should be free to criticize what's wrong with your society, as the 4 congresswomen in America are doing. You should be objective about its strengths and objective about its weaknesses, because without that objectivity, you can't make things better.
So on the point that Thaqib just mentioned now about people coming from the outside into Britain and saying, I want to be British, I want to live this kind of lifestyle, and then you're held to account by the British people and everything you do, in the actions you do, because as you said, it's a collaborative kind of effort. So Britain is what the British people make it. Then you have the idea of when people do come here, certain ethnic groups or kind of communities come here, not to use communities in like the loose term, but you usually see them throughout history, British history, use it as scapegoats when things go wrong. So I want your comment on this.
That's a normal, not in the sense of desirable, just normal, like it happens regularly in all societies for all sort of minority groupings. People, particularly dictatorially inclined people, choose as part of increasing their own personal power to win elections or to keep power if they're sort of dictators. They choose to demonize minorities and blame things on those minorities. If you look at what people are saying about Muslims in Britain today, you can find exactly the same things being said about Jews in Britain 100 years ago.
So we had Azhar Qayyum on the episode from MEND, and he spoke about this. Like in the 90s, we had the Afro-Caribbean community. They were demonized to a certain extent, and then after 9/11, post 9/11, that switched to the Muslim community, and it's been carrying on quite a while now. It's gone across to our friends over the pond.
Well, and then it's come back here with our Prime Minister who says I think there's a few kind of very disturbing comments in the past I feel like a couple of leaders that we've had. So, David Cameron called the migrants a swarm of people coming over. Boris Johnson called Niqabis letterboxes, amongst, a raft of other fun statements that he's made. And kind of so I guess kind of bringing that back to that home point is someone's come here and chosen to make Britain their society. What right do British people have to say to them, get lost, you're not part of the society?
They don't. As I said, I described something as normal behaviour. I didn't describe it as valid behaviour.
Yeah, okay. So, like, even with Boris Johnson, for example, so yourself, after Boris Johnson became the leader of the Conservative Party, you resigned as the...
Yeah. I've often been asked, do I think Boris Johnson is Islamophobic? And the answer is I have no reason to believe that he is. It's worse than that. Because Boris Johnson will choose to denigrate and mock Muslim women who wear niqab and burqa, for example, for his own electoral reasons. I have no idea what he really thinks of Muslims, because I have no idea what Mr. Johnson really thinks of most things, because he is such a consistent liar. And on many things, he's also extremely ignorant. One of the things I read recently was a chapter that he wrote in a book in 2007 about Muslims called And Then Came the Muslims. It was the last additional chapter added to the second edition of his book about the Dream of Rome, I think. And a Guardian journalist sent it to me. I read the whole chapter before I gave her my responses. And it demonstrates massive historical ignorance, despite the fact that this guy likes to pretend that he's an intellectual. He's clearly well read. He did classics at university. But at the same time, there are massive holes in his historical knowledge, which are papered over by the fact that he's such a good writer and writes such colourful language. But he has a handful of poor quality sources, and he demonstrates massive ignorance. But he's also dangerous because his communication skills are so high. I described it as the equivalent of giving a 10-year-old child a flamethrower. The consequences are never good.
Do you think it would be better if he was... Well, if his views were wrong, but at least he believed in them, whereas, as you said, he seems to be just a liar who flip-flops around.
Well, if he had one set of beliefs that he stuck to, at least he'd be consistent, whereas he flip-flops over everything. The reason why he's totally unfit to be a party leader or a prime minister is precisely because you cannot believe a word that he says. So I resigned because I consider he's morally unfit to be prime minister, A, because he's a consistent liar, and secondly, because he's willing to advance his own personal career regardless of the harm he causes other people.
So, a comment on the system that got him elected as Prime Minister. So we have this idea where person comes in after a Prime Minister resigns, and then the party does a vote on who within the party takes over. And then we have this kind of feeling, a general sentiment from the public, where a general
not the public,
election...
members of the Conservative Party. It was only members of the Conservative Party.
So the members of the Conservative Party voted, and after the vote finished, and then we have the leader of the Conservative Party and eventually Prime Minister, we have some kind of feeling from the public that there should be a general election held. What do you think about that? Because it's used against Boris Johnson all the time. So when he came in Prime Minister, everyone's using the argument, you were not elected by the general public.
And in 2006, he said the same thing to Gordon Brown.
He said the same thing.
Well, my personal forecast is that I think we are heading for a general election. Mr. Johnson's strategy is transparently obvious. Step one, you make impossible demands of the European Union, and when the European Union refuses to give in to your impossible demands, you say that they're being unreasonable. You then go to Parliament and try to get a no-deal Brexit through Parliament, and because Parliament has more sense than that, when Parliament says, no, you can't do it, you then turn around and say to the country, give me new MPs because the European Union's being so unreasonable and these MPs are stopping you, the public, getting what you wanted, which was Brexit, and therefore give me new MPs and a new mandate. It's a transparently obvious strategy, and that is where I think it's going.
Do you think that it will work?
Do I think it will work? I don't know. It depends on the British voter, and one of the things at the age of 68 I've learned is never underestimate the stupidity of other people. And people often are very foolish. But on the other hand, I don't think the British people are quite so stupid as to fall for that. And the polling data at the moment is supportive of my view.
So like you said, so you made a comment that like, some people are stupid. It's a fact, isn't it? So do you think that the democratic system in this country allows for effective governments to come into place when everyone is voting over the age of 18?
The broad answer to that question is yes. And one of the things I'd encourage you to do, although I often talk about this, I haven't actually done it myself. I've downloaded them, but I haven't actually read them. The Federalist Papers. It's a series of papers written by the leaders of the American Revolution in the after 1776. Alexander Hamilton, who the musical is about, was one of the writers. There were a number of other people writing about it as well. And I've not read them, but I've read a lot of people's comments about them. And the key thing that the founding fathers of the United States of America were really focused on was the tension between democracy in the sense of people choosing and voting by the people, and the need to protect the system as a whole from the people making stupid, irrational choices. That's why, if you read the American Constitution, it puts so much effort into the separation of powers. The Constitution is so hard to amend, but can be amended. And why, for example, there is no provision at all in the United States Constitution for referenda, because they regarded referenda as dangerous. Some of the American states do have ballot initiatives, like California and Colorado and so on, and sometimes they have good outcomes, sometimes they have appalling outcomes, but there's no provision in the national constitution at all for referenda. And that is quite deliberate, because the founding fathers were really conscious about this tension between the fact that legitimacy comes from election by the people, but you can't trust the people to make sensible decisions, which is why the people choose the representatives, and it's the representatives that make the decisions.
So what about when the representative flip-flops? So we have
or cases where if people can't make a sensible decision, what makes us think they can choose a sensible representative? They'll go and choose Boris Johnson.
Well, you have all these processes for trying to sort of screen people out. It doesn't always work. I mean, we have the American Constitution right now is being tested by Mr. Trump, because in 2016, through the various accidents of history we could go into if we had more time, the American people chose somebody as president who is completely unfit for the job. And it's a real test of how well designed that Constitution is, that the United States has held together since then, and I think will continue to hold together and will survive Trump.
But isn't that itself testament to the fact that it doesn't work? So you'll have...
No, it's a testament to the fact it does work.
Because a constitution can't just fall and just disappear. It will have to work with the person in charge. So if Donald Trump gets elected, he'll have to work with the constitution he has.
Yeah, you can't guarantee that you will always elect sensible people. The test of a constitution is how well does it work when you elect somebody who is not sensible.
Well, Britain doesn't have a constitution.
We have a constitution, it's unwritten, which is one of its weaknesses. I'm a member of various NGOs that support having a written constitution, which is a separate issue. But we do have a constitution, and it is actually working in its own peculiar way. So, for example, the Speaker of Parliament, John Bercow, who's one of my heroes, has really taken decisive steps to protect Parliament's integrity and sovereignty against an overpowering executive. The idea that Parliament could be prorogued to allow a no-deal Brexit to happen because Parliament wasn't sitting, it's quite clear that Parliament has taken steps already, for example, by requiring 2 weekly reports about Northern Ireland to ensure that Parliament cannot be prorogued. And I can guarantee you there's no way these MPs are going to let Boris Johnson simply shut down Parliament.
So that's dependent on time then. So like John Bercow, he's been the Speaker of the House for the past how many years?
10 years.
10 years. Going further back to like...
Previous speakers were pretty good people as well.
So during the time...
Ultimately, we have a society that consists of human beings. We have to choose MPs who are human beings, our Prime Minister is a human being. You can't wish that away and imagine that if we were governed by angels all the time, wouldn't life be wonderful? We have to deal with the real world as it is.
So we have like Margaret Thatcher when she was in power. There was no effective opposition for Margaret Thatcher. And it showed in the policy she enacted. My question would be, people who bring across ideas such as different political ideas that wouldn't really be something that we'd be accustomed to. So Plato, when he writes in his book The Republic, it's mostly like a dialogue.
Yeah.
He talks about the philosopher king,
Mm.
and he talks about the general idea of the Senate and how they vote on behalf of the people. They have expertise of certain people, and it works like in terms of the electoral college, but mostly with regards to knowledge.
Mm.
So a person who had knowledge in a certain sector would be voting on behalf of the people who are invested in that sector.
Mm.
And then you'd have the executive of that country. You'd have the leader who would be well-rounded in all the things.
Mm.
And then that is how you would achieve this quote-unquote perfect democracy or democratic
Well,
procedure.
perfect democracies are never going to happen. And if you look at the liberal democracies that we have in the world, they're very different. I'm not saying the British system is perfect. It's not. There are lots of things wrong with it. I don't believe in the first-past-the-post electoral system. I've been a member of the Electoral Reform Society for about 15 years now. I would like to change the physical layout of the House of Commons so that the shape is physically more sort of conducive towards sort of cross-party collaboration rather than having the benches directly opposite and so on. There are lots of things you can do. I believe in a written constitution. I'm not saying this country is perfect, but it's actually not quite as nightmarish as you're trying to point out.
Well, obviously, to be clear, we're just being devil's advocates. I think there's a lot that I had a list of questions from your experience that I wanted to talk about, and I do appreciate we're running out of time. But what I wanted to kind of close on was, what do you think in terms of grassroots level work? Do you think, and what role do you think Muslim youth can play in kind of contributing positively to British society, and what kind of grassroots level work do you think is the most important?
Because you yourself work with the Manchester Muslim Jewish Forum, don't you?
Yes, I'm the co-chair of the Muslim Jewish Forum of Greater Manchester. My key message to young Muslims is to get engaged by joining mainstream organisations and having your voice heard, while at the same time remembering the balance that you have a personal life to live and a career to build. And it's really important to be personally successful yourself. You can do far more for the world if you're rich than if you're poor. You can do far more for the world if you're at the top of a large hierarchy, chief executive of a big company, than if you're working in the mailroom. So don't throw away your own prospects in your own career because you're trying to make the world perfect at the age of 21.
Okay, yeah, that's a very kind of good and strong closing, and we really appreciate you coming on. And I think I have a list of further things to talk about, so maybe we'll try and get you back. Maybe and after October, November, we'll get you back to see
I'm happy to.
If your No Deal Brexit predictions were correct.
Right.
But you can follow the Middle West podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and anywhere you get your podcasts. We have a Facebook page, the Middle West PC, Twitter at the Middle West PC. You can email us at middlewestpc@gmail.com with your feedback, how you thought the episode went, any further questions, and where can we find you, your website? Can we email you directly?
My website is www.mohammed, Amin.com. And if you go to the Contact Me page of my website, there's an email address which is accessible to humans but not accessible to robots.
Very nice. If you are a human listening to this podcast, then you can send Mohammed Amin an email and engage, interact. I think your Twitter is quite active as well.
Yes, Mohammed_Amin.
Yeah, and there's a good bit of especially if you go into the history, there's some feisty bits there for some bedtime reading. But we really appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks with another episode of the Middle West podcast.